Okay, I think we are live. Welcome to our SAT Writing Grammar Crash Course. My name is Erika, and can we just confirm for me in the chat, can you see me? Can you hear me? Can you see my slideshow? And then we'll go ahead and get started. Just let me know in the YouTube chat. Welcome. Okay, it looks like we are live. Waiting for just a little bit more confirmation from folks in the chat. Okay, perfect. And oh, you are so welcome for these videos. We're so happy to do them. Okay, we are live. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Erika, and welcome to our SAT Writing Grammar Crash Course. Now, we're going to talk about what that is in just a second and what we're going to be covering today and tomorrow in our two different sessions. But let's go ahead and jump in. So to start introducing myself, my name is Erika. I'm the SAT ACT Senior Curriculum Manager here at Magoosh. So what does that mean? It means that I work on our curriculum or our content. So I think about our lessons, I think about our questions, I think about our explanations, both our written explanations or video explanations, all of that good stuff, making sure that it's presented in the way that is going to be easiest for you to learn. It also means that I think about things like our live classes, things like our crash courses like this, and the sorts of things that, again, we think will be helpful for students like you. So hopefully you like this. Let me know if you have any feedback because I read it. I have over the years taught and written materials for more than 10 different standardized tests. So the SAT and the ACT are the tests that I started with. They are my favorites. They're kind of what I come back to. So I really love these tests, but I have a lot of experience with a lot of different ones. And I live in Seattle, Washington with my husband and my two cats. You can see them right there. So that's Roz and that's Mel. They're the best. I love them so much. All right, jumping on in. So let's talk about our goals for today. So goals. We are going to learn SAT writing, section structure, and strategy. So this is an SAT writing grammar focus session, but we're going to do a little bit at the top that kind of goes over the section as a whole. And just to kind of note, I'm seeing a question in the chat, is this being recorded? Yes, it is going to be recorded. It is going to be on our YouTube channel. So if you do have to go or you can't make it tomorrow, you'll be able to see it then. So we're going to cover kind of broadly some SAT writing section structure and strategy at the top. And then we're going to get into major grammatical concepts. So we're going to discuss the sorts of grammar things that are tested on the SAT and talk about what's not tested on the SAT so you don't have to learn it. We're also going to explore how these topics are specifically tested on the SAT. There's a lot of different ways that grammar can be tested. In real life, mostly grammar is correcting an essay, right? Where there are a million options for how to redo a sentence, but on the SAT, there's 4. So that makes things a little bit simpler, but it also means that there are specific strategies that we can apply. We're going to talk about those today. And then we're going to practice that SAT writing question strategy in some SAT style questions from Magoosh. All right, to answer kind of some logistical questions, again, this is going to be today and tomorrow. So today we are doing an hour and a half. And tomorrow we're going to be doing another hour and a half. So in a second, we'll jump in, but we're going to be covering those kind of general topics today. And we're going to get into some of the grammatical topics today. And then tomorrow we're going to get into even more grammatical topics and then hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for questions. Now, there's also something that I want to share, which is that today we have a code that you can use if you like today's webinar, like tomorrow's webinar, you go, yes, love this, want more of this. We have a 20% off code, SAT Crash 20. So like it's SAT, it's a crash course, it's 20% off. It's pretty easy to remember, SAT Crash 20, and that's 20% off of any ACT or SAT plan on Magoosh. So that can be our online programs, that can be our live classes, anything on Magoosh, either SAT or ACT. I'm going to show this code again later in toward the end of our live stream, but just know that this is available for you. There is also something that we are doing. We are doing a raffle for a 1-month online plan for the SAT. That is something that we'll do at the end of today. And we're going to do another one tomorrow. So stick around for the end and we'll do the raffle. And it's going to be a random person who's still viewing at that point. So stick around. You might get picked. All right. So let's go ahead and start with kind of the general topics about the SAT writing section. So the SAT writing section is 35 minutes. It is always 35 minutes. That's just the deal. Now, it is 35 minutes and it is 44 questions. It is always 44 questions. Now, you might notice that that is more questions than minutes. That means that this section is really, really fast paced. Now, sometimes students can approach the timing in less than ideal ways. They can check after every single question to make sure they're going really, really fast, or they don't check the clock at all. And that's not a good idea. If you've watched our free live class, you'll have heard me talked about this before. But it is 35 minutes and 44 questions. The best way to think about timing is by breaking that down into chunks of questions. And when we have passage-based sections like writing, breaking it down into passages as your chunks is going to be the best. So here we've got 4 passages that are always 11 questions each, right? So because we have those 4 passages, we can think of this as 9 minutes per passage, and it's 11 questions. Hi, Sean, good to see you. Sean is a frequent flyer at these and actually won one of our raffles before. So if you want to be like Sean, stick around. So we're going to think about the SAT writing section as 9 minutes per passage, and it's 11 questions. Now, I want to answer a question that I saw come in through the chat because it's really, really important. The SAT writing section is not the essay. In fact, the essay really doesn't exist anymore. The writing section is something that I'm actually going to show you in a couple of seconds. It is not actually physically writing. It is answering multiple choice questions. So this is required. This is part of your total score on the SAT. So the only reason it wouldn't be required is if you are going to a school that does not require the SAT. So this will be something you take if you are taking the SAT. Just getting that out of the way. This is not the essay section. It's not that. Okay, so thinking about this section, to recap the slide, this is a really fast-paced section. Thinking about the timing as per passage is going to help you the most. You've got about 9 minutes per passage. It's actually slightly less than 9 minutes, but that's going to be a good benchmark. So I recommend going through one passage, checking the clock, should be about 9 minutes in. Next passage, checking the clock, should be another 9 minutes in, and so on and so forth. And that's a good way to just make sure that you're not going to run out of time, but also that you're not unnecessarily rushing through the section. So 9 is the number to memorize for this section. Okay, now, again, if you're not entirely sure what the SAT writing section is, this is what it looks like. So this is the one where there is a passage, but that passage has like numbers in it for different questions. So with the reading section, right, it's a passage like this, but it doesn't have any numbers. The writing section has numbers. So that's how you're going to recognize it. It looks like this. Now, if you have taken the SAT before, or if you've taken a practice test, and actually let me know in the chat, have you taken a practice test before, or the real deal? Have you taken an SAT in some form? Just give me a yes or a no in the chat so I know kind of what we're working with here. But while you do that, if you have taken this before, this might look familiar. If you have not, this is probably going to be new information. I want to make sure that you know how to interpret this. So if you see a boxed number, okay, I'm seeing a lot of yeses coming in, so this is probably going to be review. Oh, if you've taken the PSAT, that's going to be pretty similar. Oh, you can also answer in this poll that's just come up on your screen. Okay. So if you have taken the SAT, again, this is familiar. So the big thing that you're going to want to recognize in these writing passages is the boxed numbers. So you can see those, they're in blue here because this is a Magoosh test, but it's going to look very similar on the actual SAT. It's going to be a box with a number in it. And those correspond to question numbers. All right. So let me go ahead and pull out my pen really quickly. All right, so you should see, if you see a 25 On the other side of the page, you're going to see something like 25. That is a way too big of a pen. let me fix that. All right, we're going to go with green and we're going to go with a smaller line width. So you should see 25 next to it, and then your options A, B, C, D. So that question 25 is going to correspond to this underlined portion. So you see how there's an underline right next to the 25. That is associated with question 25. The answer choices will be replacements for that underlined portion. We see a very similar thing here with 26. So we would have a question next to 26. 26, again, with answer choices. Again, down here for 27, you would see the question 27 right next to it. And then 28 is kind of interesting. So once again, with 28, we'd have question 28 right next to it, but you'll notice that question 28 doesn't have an underlined portion next to it, whereas 25 has an underlined portion, 26 has an underlined portion, 27 has an underlined portion. When you see that there's a box number that doesn't have an underlined portion, it's going to deal with what comes before. So it might be something like, give me a sentence to wrap up this paragraph, or maybe should I put one of these sentences somewhere else in the paragraph, or does the author achieve this goal in the whole essay? So those are going to typically have a question stem next to them. So just some words describing what's going on before it goes into the answer choices. But again, it's still a question number. What you don't want to mix this up with, and I've seen students do this before, so I'm noting it now, is those bracketed numbers. So we can see some bracketed numbers here. I see this 1, this 2, this 3, this 4, 5, 6, and 7. Those are sentence numbers. So those are not questions. Those are what sentence we're on in the paragraph. And those might be dealt with in something like question 28. So here I would guess that question 28 would be something like, the author is considering moving sentence 2 somewhere else in the passage. Where should they put it? And it might be answers like before sentence 1, after sentence 3, after sentence 4. So those bracketed numbers are not question numbers. They're something that might be dealt with in a question like 28. Cool. All right. Hopefully we don't have any questions around the structure of the actual SAT writing section. If you do, feel free to throw them in the chat. But this is what we're working with. Okay. So I'm actually going to rewind for just a second. Given that we have the question numbers in the passage, right? And we know that the questions are going to be right across from those question numbers. 25 will be right next to 25, 26 will be right next to 26, 27, blah, blah, blah. And for the most part, these questions are associated with just an underlined portion. We know exactly where to look. What does that mean for our approach? That means that we're going to answer questions as we read. And this is particularly important to note in comparison to the reading section. Again, if you attended our live class, you know that my recommendation for the reading section is to skim the passage and then go to the questions. That is not the case for the writing section. For the writing section, we're going to read until we get to one of those question numbers, and then we're going to do that question. Then we're going to go to the next question number, and then we're going to do that question, and so on and so forth, skipping kind of back and forth between reading the passage and answering those questions. So, tips here. Writing as a section is a lot more like math than reading. So with math, we have kind of a limited subset of information. We know that everything we need is in the question. Kind of the same thing here. We know that it's in the underlined portion or in the area surrounding that underlined portion. We don't have to go hunting for things like we do in reading, where we go, where is that information? I don't know. Or it's like about something bigger about the whole passage that really isn't super involved in the writing section. So as a result, we know where we're looking. We can kind of deal with it piece by piece. So there's no need for something like an initial skim or paragraph summaries or keyword skimming, the sorts of things that we do, again, in the reading section. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check out our live class that's posted on our channel, but I talk more about those strategies there that are really useful for reading. They're not useful here. So questions show up near the necessary context. We can do them as we reach them. Whole passage knowledge, like an understanding of what the passage is about as a whole, is not going to be super useful. We're not going to get to questions that deal with the whole passage until the very end, and they might not even exist. And if there is one, there's one. So whole passage knowledge is not super important. Don't really bother with it. You don't need to read in advance. And then if we need those strategies, maybe to figure out where a sentence might go within a paragraph, maybe understanding the paragraph as a whole would be useful. Or if we're trying to conclude a paragraph, okay, understanding the paragraph as a whole would be useful. Then we can bring in strategies like, let me try to summarize this paragraph, etc. But they're not something we're going to default to the way we do in reading. So that makes writing maybe a little bit less taxing of a section because we're kind of just going piece by piece. We're not doing as much of that like larger logical structure stuff that we're doing in the reading section. Okay, so now that we have that, let's learn about passage types. So in the reading section, there are a bunch of different passage types. There's our literary narrative or fiction, there's our historical documents, there's natural science, there's social science. So what are we dealing with on the writing section? There's no such thing. There aren't passage types on SAT writing because, again, it's not about the passage as a whole for the most part. It is about little pieces of the passage for the most part. It's about writing, not reading. So what does that mean? These passages are going to be a little bit more narrative, so they're going to be a little bit more storytelling-y. They're going to be a little bit less academic. So they're not going to have a ton of like really complicated words. They're not going to have a ton of really complicated relationships that you need to understand. We're not going to go into depth about like really nasty biological theories. That's not the deal here. So they're a little bit easier to read for the most part than some reading passages. There will be some differences between the passages, obviously, because they have slightly different topics. So one might be about buses and one might be about icebergs, but the differences between those topics aren't really going to impact the questions. The questions are going to be on the same sorts of things. They're not going to make the questions any harder or any easier. So for us, that means there's really no reason to skip full passages. So in the reading section, we might know going in that we are weaker on historical documents, and we might just save those for the end because we know that those are not our strong passage types. For writing, there's no such thing. So we're never really going to skip full passages. Instead, if we are skipping questions and saying, I'm going to come back to those later, we're going to skip based on the question. So if a question is giving us grief, then we can circle it, mark it on our bubble sheet, come back to it at the end of the section, but there's no reason to skip an entire passage. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about when I say skipping, again, that's something we cover in that free live class that we did. So I recommend checking it out on our channel. But when I say skip, basically what I mean is saying, I'm not going to do this right now, coming back to it at the end of the section, even if that just means guessing. It means not wasting time on something that we're having a hard time with. So we're going to skip based on the question, not based on the passage. Okay, let's get into question structure on the writing section. So writing questions have 4 answer choices, of which 1 is right and 3 are wrong. Classic. That's the structure of pretty much the entire test. Now, an interesting thing about writing questions is that very often the first answer choice for writing questions is no change. And this is particularly common with the grammar questions that we're going to be looking at today. So it's particularly common when there is an underlined portion, when there isn't a question stem. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and if we get a poll up on time, you can answer in the poll, or you can answer in the chat. So the first answer is often no change, which is, hey, the sentence is right as is. Leave the underlined portion alone. The test maker wrote it correct from the jump. And then answers like B, C, and D will be, here's an alternative to the underlined portion. I want to ask you, do you think the answer choice A, it is correct as is, no change, is going to be more likely to be the correct answer, less likely to be the correct answer, or the same amount likely to be the correct answer as the other answer choices. So do you think it is more likely to be no change, less likely to be no change, or the same likelihood to be no change as changing? What do we think? Let me know in the chat. And I'm going to wait for some answers to come in. Seeing some great answer choice, some great answers here. Okay. Awesome. So I'm seeing in the poll and in the chat that the most common response is the same, which is correct. It is correct that it is the same amount likely as B, C, or D. There is a 25% chance that the answer is A, a 25% chance that the answer is B, a 25% chance that the answer is C, and a 25% chance that the answer is D. Now, you knew this for the most part, which is awesome, but it is a common misconception that no change is less likely to be the right answer, because a lot of folks go, but why would they write the right answer in the test? That's too tricky, right? They wouldn't do that. They want me to have to look at the other answers. And that's just not the case, right? They know that test takers are afraid of picking A. And so they make it the right answer just as often as the others. So I saw a really great comment. It's the same amount likely, although I have a mild heart attack when I get no change. That's a really common response. So if you're going, hey, I'm really nervous about picking no change, that makes me scared, I'm telling you, don't be scared, because it is just as likely to be the answer as the other ones. A lot of students just don't consider no change, or they just kind of skip it because they go, it's got to be one of the other ones. That is not the case. Give the original answer just as much attention as you give the others. So most of you knew this already, which is awesome. But if you didn't know that, this is really important. I see a lot of students mess this up. Okay, so now that we have that misconception out of the way, let's talk about the questions themselves, or the question content. So there are kind of two categories of writing questions. Now, the first category of writing questions is grammar, and grammar questions are going to be focused on rules, right? So that's going to be things like, what sort of punctuation do I want here? So it's based on punctuation rules. Or it's going to be things like agreement. So that's going to be about rules of subject verb agreement, subject pronoun agreement, things like that. Things like parallelism. So what are our rules for lists or comparisons? It's going to be focused on rules. So with these grammar questions, there's going to be right and wrong, and it's pretty explicit. There's no like, well, I think this. No, there's just rules that we can follow for this test. Rhetoric is the other type of writing question. Now, grammar questions are more common. They make up more of the section. Rhetoric questions, however, are in there. And these ones are going to be focused more on meaning. So I like to think of these questions as reading questions in disguise. So what does that mean? I'm going to give an example so you can kind of understand what that means. So on the reading section, right, we might have a question that goes, okay, here's a word or a phrase or a sentence. And the question might ask, what is the author's goal in writing that word or phrase or sentence? So what is the author trying to do? What's their purpose? What's their goal? What's the point? In a SAT writing rhetoric question, they might go, okay, I'm going to give you the point. Here is what the author is trying to do. Here's their goal. Here's their purpose, right? Figure out what sentence or phrase or word goes here based on that goal. See how that's the reverse, right? So in reading, they give us the thing that was written. We have to figure out the goal. In SAT writing rhetoric, they give us the goal. We have to figure out what they should write. Sneaky, right? But it's the same concept. So this is focused on meaning. So you can see that we aren't really going to be able to use rules here. We're going to have to use best practices, right? We're going to have to understand what the author wants to do and how the author can best communicate that. But this is going to be a little bit more of a judgment call. Again, there's still going to be one right answer and 3 wrong answers, but it's not going to be as rules based. So these can be a little bit trickier. Another example in the reading section, we might use a transition word to figure out what's going to come next. In an SAT writing rhetoric question, we might use what comes next to figure out the transition word, and so on and so forth, right? We might, in reading, use a word with a specific tone to figure out how the author feels. In an SAT writing rhetoric question, we might use how the author feels to figure out a specific tone word. So same ideas, just kind of in reverse. So what does that mean for us, right? We have 2 different types of questions. What does that mean for our strategy? It means we got 2 strategies for this section, and we are going to base our strategy on the question. So if we have a grammar question, we are going to use one strategy. If we've got a rhetoric question, we are going to use a different strategy. And if you're going, how are we supposed to remember all the grammar rules when we're taking the test? We're going to learn them in here. So we're going to learn the grammar rules in this course, and then you can review them on your own so that you remember them in the test. And what are some of the grammar rules? Again, we're going to cover them here. So we're going to cater our strategy to the question depending on what that question is doing. So tips here. If we've got a grammar question, like the ones that we're going to go over in like 5 minutes, we are going to approach it kind of like math, right? So with math, we have a very limited context and we have specific math rules. With grammar, again, we have an underlined portion, a very limited context, and we have specific grammar rules. That's what we're doing here, right? So what do we do in math? We use the answer choices. Now in math, we're typically using the answer choices maybe to back solve, plug them into the question, or pick our own numbers and plug them into the answer choices. With SAT writing grammar, it's going to be a little bit different. So instead of plugging in the answer choices, instead we're going to look for the differences between the answer choices to figure out what's being tested. So if we see that the answer choices, one has a comma, one has a period, one has a semicolon, and one has a dash. That's testing punctuation. Okay, so I'm going to be thinking about my punctuation rules to evaluate this question. All right, so it narrows our focus. Similarly, if we see, I don't know, the verb change from past tense to present tense, maybe we're dealing with verb tense. We're going to be thinking about our tense rules and strategies. If we see a noun change from singular to plural, we're going to be thinking about our agreement rules and strategies, and so on and so forth. So with grammar, look at the answer choices to figure out what's being tested so you know what rules and strategies to apply. We're going to learn those rules and strategies today and tomorrow. Now, a clue that you have grammar. Usually grammar questions do not have a question stem. They have an underlined portion, and then the answer choices are no change, and then alternatives to the underlined portion. Usually. Sometimes a grammar question will have a question stem. Sometimes, does it ever not have an underlined portion? I don't think so. Typically, I think 99% of the time, grammar questions will have an underlined portion, usually no question stem. So usually if you're seeing something like that, probably a grammar question, the next step would then be to look at the answer choices to see if there's something grammatically going on. And again, a question stem is just text after the number. So for instance, let me just draw that. So if you had, say, question 25, a question stem would be like the words after that. Like, what should the author do to blah, 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 with a question mark. That's a question stem. And then we have the answer choices. Usually for a grammar question, no question stem. It just skips straight to the answer choices with A being no change in almost all cases. Does that make sense? Cool. So that's grammar. Let's talk quickly about rhetoric. So rhetoric because it's a reading question in disguise, we're going to approach it like reading. Well, how do we approach reading? Again, if you've seen that free live class, we know that we predict on reading questions, right? We come up with our own answer before we look at the answer choices. So with rhetoric questions, because it's doing the same thing those reading questions are doing, because those answer choices are a little bit more up for debate almost, they're a little bit more mind game-y, they're not as based on rules, we're going to come up with our own answer before we look at those answer choices so that they don't drag us into traps. So a clue that we have a rhetoric question, rhetoric questions may have a question stem. They may not have an underlined portion, but the biggest clue that we have a rhetoric question is that it looks like one of the topics that are tested by rhetoric questions. Now, we are not covering rhetoric questions in this crash course. We are covering grammar in this crash course. So we are covering the majority of the questions on the writing section in this crash course, the grammar ones. So we're dealing with the rules, we're dealing with the ones that typically don't have a question stem. Rhetoric questions, briefly, we'll talk about what those are at the end of our crash course tomorrow, but that's not what we're focusing on, or else this would be way too long. So let's talk about what grammar we're going to cover. So let me just delete that real quick. SAT writing grammar. What is it? What's tested here? So SAT writing grammar, there are a bunch of topics that are tested. So I'm just going to run through them. Sentence structure, modifiers, punctuation, parallelism, tense, agreement, possessives, and idiom are going to be the 8 topics that we are going to cover in this crash course. Now, today I'm going to attempt to cover sentence structure, modifiers, and punctuation. We're making good time so far, so I think I'm going to get to all 3. If we don't get to punctuation, we'll do it tomorrow. But the rest of them are going to be in our second session, the one that we're going to do tomorrow. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in with sentence structure. So sentence structure is a very big umbrella. There is a lot under sentence structure because sentence structure is really just, is this sentence a sentence? Is it a sentence? And that can be a lot of different things, right? So is it a well-crafted sentence of any real structure, or is it a fragment? So it actually doesn't have all the pieces of a sentence, or is it a run-on? Is it something that has too many pieces to be a complete sentence? Now, we're going to get more into kind of the nitty gritty of sentence structure as we start talking about modifiers, as we start talking about punctuation, and even as we talk about parallelism tomorrow. But we're going to kind of introduce the broader topic of sentence structure and some broader strategy now. So let's talk tips on sentence structure, because it seems like this should be easy, but it's actually not. So let's talk about this. So definitionally, a sentence, right? A sentence is also known as an independent clause. And I only tell you this because I'm going to be using the phrase independent clause throughout the lesson. It means sentence. It is something that can stand alone as its own idea and just be done, right? It doesn't need anything else to be complete. So what does that mean? What is a sentence? What is an independent clause? Well, it's got to have a subject, a noun. It's got to have a verb, and it's got to have a complete thought. So it's got to wrap up. It can't just be in the middle of a thought. So if I say, I ran, subject, I, verb, ran. It's a complete thought. I did it. It's done. Great. That's a sentence. But if I said, I ran because what? Now that's not a complete thought anymore. That's not a complete sentence. That would be wrong. If I said, I ran because I was late, subject, verb, and a complete thought again. So now we have a complete sentence once again. So there's going to be a little bit of judgment when it comes to sentence structure. Is this a complete thought? That's one of the things that makes this a little bit tricky. The thing that makes this more tricky is the clue that when we have a sentence structure question, typically we're going to have a long, complicated sentence. Because if the sentence was really short it would probably be pretty obvious whether it was a sentence or not a sentence, right? Because there's not all that much crap to dig through. When the SAT is doing this, they want to make it hard for us. So what they're typically going to do is they're going to make this sentence so convoluted. It's going to be like 5 lines long. It's going to have a million commas, and it's going to make you, as you're reading it, just go, okay, fine. And just kind of want to believe it's a sentence because you don't want to read and decipher it. That's the trick. Because oftentimes when a sentence is long and complicated, it's a run-on. It's got too many pieces. But also sometimes it's a fragment. Sometimes they put in a bunch of unnecessary pieces to hide the fact that it's missing some necessary pieces. Really, really bad. So if you see a sentence that is particularly nasty, really likely that it's sentence structure, that they're hiding the fact that that sentence isn't really a sentence. Now, I'm not telling you how to break that down quite yet. I'm letting you know that it's coming. All right, that's coming. I'm going to help you with that, but for now, it's just a clue. Let's talk a couple more tips for recognizing these sorts of questions. If you ever see a noun disappear between answer choices, maybe an answer says it, an answer says they, an answer says a noun, and then an answer has nothing, no noun. Whoa, okay. That should be a clue to you that maybe, hey, maybe I don't need a noun at all, or maybe I definitely do need a noun. So that's going to be a clue to you that you should pay attention here. All right. So if you see a noun disappear between the answer choices, sentence structure. Now this one's a little bit trickier because we also need verbs in sentences. So if a verb disappears between answer choices, that's important, right? That's going to be a clue that we either definitely need a verb or we definitely don't. But oftentimes what they do is instead of just pulling the verb out of the answer choice, they change the verb so it's not actually a verb, even though it looks like it is. So the clue here is ing or ed. And that's because ing and ed words sometimes are verbs, but sometimes they're nouns and sometimes they're adjectives. What? So for example, what's an example? Oh, I am screaming. Okay, that's a verb. I'm screaming, right? Okay, that's happening. That's a verb. I like screaming. Well, now screaming is an activity. That's a noun. I ran through the haunted house screaming. Now it's describing what I'm doing. It's an adjective. What? So it's the same word, but it serves a different function in each of those sentences. So what they'll do is they'll add those ings or eds into answer choices versus what's like a traditional verb, like a just a regular present tense or past tense verb. And they make you think that it's a verb tense issue, but it's not, because actually secretly that thing that looks like it's a verb is not a verb. And that destroys the sentence structure because now that verb is missing. Sneaky. Very sneaky. But for now, the clue, if you see an ing or an ed in the answer choices, just go, ooh, is that actually a verb? Sentence structure. So we need to pay attention to the meaning as we go through to kind of go, is this describing? Is this an object or is this an action? Okay. Now I'm not going to give you any more right now because I want to do something, kind of an experiment. I'm going to give you a question. And I have not given you the tools to break this question down, but I want to just try it together. So I want to break this down first together, and we're going to come back and do this again once I give you a little more information, but let's just kind of approach it together for now. So first thing I'm going to notice, long sentence, right? Lot of sentence happening here. Okay, like 4 lines. All right. I'm also going to notice how many commas. 1, 2, 3 commas. Okay, complicated. So I'm going, okay, this is a long, complicated sentence. This could potentially be sentence structure. I'm going to look at the answer choices. Depict ed, ed. Is that a verb? Is it an adjective? I don't know. Okay, depict ing, ing. Is it a verb? Is it an adjective? I don't know. Okay, they depicted, well, one, hello, a noun appearing out of nowhere. Do I need that or do I not need it? Okay, and again, an ed. And then the last one, a simple verb, but without that noun. Okay, we've had about 1 million clues that this is a sentence structure question. I'm gonna bet that all of these answer choices, but one, is not a sentence, okay, or not a sentence. So what I'd like you to do, again, I haven't given you the tools to break down the sentence. I want you to try. I want you to take 30 seconds and then in the chat or in the poll, go ahead and answer for me. Do you think the answer is A, B, C, or D? Again, I'm expecting a guess. So do your best, but we are going to come back to this one with better tools in a second. So A, B, C, or D, with the first one being A, second one being B, third one being C, fourth one being D. All right, and we got a poll up, so answer in the poll if you can. Going to take about 10 more seconds. Okay. And we can go ahead and close out that poll. But what I'm seeing here is that we got a bunch of different answers, right? And I can only see some of the answers popping up here and there, but once we in the poll, we can kind of take a look at the differences. But I'm seeing, hey, a bunch of different answers, and I'm seeing in the chat some folks going, nah, I don't know, maybe a question mark next to the answer, maybe changing the answer. Okay, and then let's break this down. We got 39% at no change, 33% on depicting, 15% on they depicted, and 12% on depicts. All right, so we've got a bunch of different answers. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the right one is quite yet, because again, we're going to learn something and then we're going to come back to this one. But moral of the story, this is sentence structure. It feels like we should know what a sentence is. The way they make these sentences, the way they craft them, makes it really difficult to tell what's up. So we could recognize that this was sentence structure, but we couldn't really tell how to make it a sentence. We're going to come back to this in just a second, but I want to teach you something first so that we can figure out how to break this sentence down. So we're coming back to this one, I promise. Let's learn what a modifier is. So we noticed probably in the last in this problem that there were a bunch of commas, right? And we might have been going, what are all of them doing, right? It can't be that all of this information is critical to the sentence. A lot of this is just fluff, right? It's extra stuff the test maker's throwing in there that isn't necessary, that's just here to confuse me. And that's what a modifier is. So a modifier is an adjective, an adverb, a descriptive phrase, something that gives a little bit of character to the sentence. It gives a little bit more description, a little bit more color, a little bit more fluff, but is not necessary to the grammar or the core meaning of the sentence. So what that means is that if we take the adjectives and adverbs and descriptive phrases out of that sentence, we should still have a sentence. It'll be a shorter sentence, but it will still be a sentence. What does that mean for us? It means that if we have a terrible sentence and we go, I cannot tell if that is a sentence, take the fluff and cut it. Get rid of the adjectives, the adverbs, the modifiers, get them out of that sentence. And what that's going to do is make that sentence so much shorter, easier, to the point where we can look at it and we can go, oh, well, duh, that's not a sentence. Or like, duh, that is a sentence. They've buried a pretty simple question in fluff. Get rid of the fluff and it becomes a simple question again. So let's talk tips for how to do this. Modifiers make sentences more complicated. Get rid of them. So when we get rid of modifiers, we can physically cross them out on our paper. So if you've got a paper test, you can with your pencil cross them out, or you can read over them, right? So kind of like we might in reading if we're skimming, where we just kind of like skip over sentences, just pass our eyes over them. We can do that here where we just pass our eyes over the modifiers and read around them. Now, this is, like I mentioned, very useful for sentence structure questions, for taking a convoluted sentence and making it less convoluted. But it's also useful whenever you're lost, because oftentimes when you're lost, it's because there's so much fluff, right? So when you're going, I don't know what's going on, default to cutting the fluff, simplifying that sentence down. Often it brings to light what's wrong with the sentence. So let's talk a little bit more about this before we go back to that problem and cut the fluff to make it much easier. So tips. There are clues that we have modifiers, that we have something that we can cut. The first one is ing, ed. So I mentioned that ing and ed can be adjectives. They often are. So if you see a phrase that starts with ing, ed, oftentimes that phrase is descriptive. Usually if they're set off by commas, you see something after a comma that starts with an ing or an ed, cut it. It's gone. It's a descriptive phrase. Similarly, if you see a preposition, some of you may know what a preposition is. If you want to throw some examples of prepositions in the chat, go for it. But I'm going to throw some out there. So prepositions are those little relationship words. They're usually really short. So of, by, above, below, among, between, over, under, those sorts of little words. Those are prepositions. If you see a preposition, it's typically starting a prepositional phrase. A prepositional phrase is a type of modifier. It's descriptive. So let me give it some examples. So I'm going to give an example of prepositions. I ran through the haunted house. Through is a preposition. The haunted house. Through the haunted house, gone. I ran. It's still a sentence. An example of ing, ed. I ran through the haunted house screaming my head off. Screaming my head off is one of those ing phrases. We can cut that out. We can cut out through the haunted house. I ran, still a sentence. Ooh, really great example. Through the river, into the woods, off to grandmother's house. We go. So there the sentence is, we go. It's a complete sentence, but through the river, into the woods, off to grandmother's house. Those are all prepositions. Cut those prepositional phrases. Okay, so those are two types. There are more. WHs, especially when they come after commas. So some examples, which, who, when. Those words signify what's called a relative clause. You don't need to know that word, but it's a type of modifier. So if you see a which phrase or a who phrase or a when phrase, got it. That is also a word that indicates a relative clause. So for instance, I ran through the haunted house. That is at the amusement park. That is at the amusement park is one of those relative phrases. Or I ran through the haunted house, which opened last year. Which opened last year is a descriptive phrase. We can cut it out of the sentence. So again, the sentence is, I ran. All right, there are more noun phrases. So when we have a noun and we put another noun right next to it, kind of renaming that noun. It's called an appositive. Again, you don't need to know that word, but it is a type of modifier. So, and to answer a question in the chat, these are all the descriptive phrases. The ones that we're talking about right now, these are types of descriptive phrases, or descriptive clauses. So an example, I ran through the haunted house, the house of horrors, at the amusement park, Universal Studios. Okay, there, the house of horrors is renaming the haunted house. We can cut out house of horrors. The amusement park, we rename it as Universal Studios. We can cut out Universal Studios. Does that make sense? So we've got a noun after another noun, often surrounded by commas. If we're ever renaming a noun, we can cut out that second name. Okay, now with all of these, they are often set off with commas, not always, but often. So if you see a sentence with a bunch of commas, just kind of like clue yourself in to some of these previous clues to go, if I see that, there's a really decent chance it's a modifier. Again, not always. We need to consider, is this ing or ed a noun, an adjective, a verb? If it's descriptive, an adjective, we can cut it. If it's not, we probably want to leave it in. Cool. With that information, let's go back to the question and use these strategies to cut the fluff, to get rid of the extra stuff in the sentence. Okay, I want you to take a look at this sentence, which again is loaded with commas and loaded with a bunch of fluff, and tell me what are some words or phrases that we can cut out of this sentence. Just get rid of them in the chat. And again, make sure you're judging this, right? Not everything that's surrounded by commas is going to come out of the sentence. And I don't want the answer. I want, what are some words or phrases in the chat that we can cut out? I'll get us started. The first thing that I want to cut out is crew of Rexes, because it's describing the pageant. It's saying the pageant belongs to the crew of Rex. I don't care if I cut it out. I have the pageant. Still a noun, gone. Okay, beautiful. I'm seeing a bunch of folks saying, let's get rid of the themed around treasures of the earth chunk. And you are absolutely right. So we've got a comma and then an ED. So we're going, okay, clues that maybe this is a modifier. Okay, now let's just confirm, because again, especially with ing and ed, we need to be careful. Is this describing or is this a verb? All right, themed around treasures of the earth describes pageant. The pageant is themed around treasures of the earth. This is descriptive. If I cut out up until the comma, which is again what we do when we have modifiers, we cut what's between commas. We end up with the pageant included. Noun, verb, love it, love to cut that. However, now I'm seeing folks in the chat say, and then we've got included, which is another ED after a comma. And it really, really seems like we should get rid of that. But this one isn't a modifier. Because look what just happened. When I cut out themed around treasures of the earth and pulled that out of there. So now those commas are actually, they're gone, right? I pulled them out with that phrase. I've got the pageant included. That's a noun and a verb. That's a verb. That's not a modifier. That's not descriptive. See how sneaky that is? So it looks like this comma right here might be setting off included as a modifier, but really it was ending the themed modifier. So knowing the clues is important, but there's also an element of judgment here. So be careful. If we cut out the included part, this will not be a sentence. Careful. Okay. So assuming that we're keeping included, all right, that doesn't mean that we can't cut out pieces of this phrase. So let's take a look. Is there maybe a smaller chunk that we can cut out. Maybe something that's not entirely set off by commas. And to answer the question, again, tomorrow is going to be different. We're going to be covering different grammar rules tomorrow. So it's going to build on today. And how do we know if this is non-essential? Surrounded by commas helps, but again, you got to use your judgment on the meaning. Okay, got a great one. With figures in gorgeous prismatic costumes. Yes, that can all go with preposition, in preposition. Those are both prepositional phrases. With figures is describing the float. In gorgeous prismatic costumes is describing those figures. Gone. Yeah, beautiful. I'm also going to go ahead and cut out crystal because it's describing the float. Okay. Anything else? Now we might be going, hey, it's a comma followed by an ed. Maybe this whole last part is a modifier, maybe, but we don't know that because again, that underlined portion can change. So I'm going to leave depicted and attire in there. But what about the end of the sentence? Can I cut some stuff there? What do we think in the chat? Yeah, we can literally cut the whole thing. Inspired ed is describing the attire. The attire is inspired by preposition, the Earth's 4 elements. Gone. Holy moly. Okay, so this sentence is about as cut down as it can possibly get. So I'm going to go ahead and just type up this sentence, the simplified version down here. The crew, nope, just kidding, we cut that. The pageant included a float depicted attire. The pageant included a float depicted attire. Okay, where that depicted is the underlined portion. And we're trying to figure out if we want to change that or not. I would like to reopen the poll and I would like you to answer again. Do you think the answer is A, B, C, or D based on this new sentence? So should we leave it as depicted? That is a sentence. Should we change it to depicting? Should we change it to they depicted? Or should we change it to depicts? Go ahead and answer in the poll if you can. And now that the sentence is this short, you can even kind of sound it out to yourself. Which one sounds like a sentence? All right. All right, answers are looking really good. We can give it a little bit longer to put answers in, but we can go ahead and close it on up. Because now we are seeing that the majority of answers, like 75% of answers, are B, which is the correct answer, depicting. So right away, we should be able to rule out some of the more aggressively wrong answer choices. So not a ton of people picked they, not a ton of people picked they depicted. Great, because they depicted would be a run-on. We would have a noun and a verb in the first part and then another noun and a verb in the second part. That's 2 independent clauses shoved together with a comma. That's a type of run-on. Illegal. Similarly, depicts. If we just read that, the pageant included a float depicts attire. What? That doesn't make any sense, doesn't work. It seems if we're just focusing on the rules, like A might work. The pageant included a float, comma, ed. It's a modifier, right? But if we read it, we go, the pageant included afloat depicted attire. It's a verb there. So we could do the pageant included afloat and depicted attire. That would be fine, but it doesn't say that. So what we want is a modifier, descriptive, and we get that in B. The pageant included afloat depicting attire. Okay, so it's descriptive. It's describing, actually, technically, the costumes, something we've already cut out, but that is the one that creates a full sentence. The answer is B. So it still wasn't a perfect 100%, but we had about double, more than double the amount of people picking the correct answer now that we've broken it down. So modifiers are powerful when it comes to sentence structure. Now, if you're going, we need to do more of these, don't you worry. We've got more of these with our other question types. So there's more, there's more, there's more. So hold your horses. We got some more questions coming. So moral of the story, modifiers are extremely useful when it comes to sentence structure. However, we're not done with modifiers because modifiers are also useful for modifiers questions, because there are questions about modifiers themselves, about whether those modifiers are used correctly. Okay, so we're not done here. We're going to learn a little bit more about modifiers. So the first thing we're going to learn about modifiers is that they must be properly set off with commas. So we saw in that previous example that some of those modifiers were set off with commas, and some of them were not set off with commas. What's the deal with that, right? Why is it random? The answer is no, it's not random. The general rule with modifiers is that usually there are no commas if the modifiers are necessary to the meaning of the sentence. So if I need it in the sentence for that sentence to make sense, no commas. If it is unnecessary to the meaning, so it's just extra, we will have commas. And again, the commas will set it off from the sentence. So if the modifier is at the beginning of the sentence, and I'm gonna draw this really quickly. If we've got a modifier at the beginning of the sentence, we'll have a comma, and then we'll have the rest of the sentence. If we've got a modifier at the end of the sentence, we'll have a comma before it. So in both of those cases, it's setting it off from the sentence. If we've got a modifier in the middle of a sentence, we'll have a comma on either side. So in any of those cases, that modifier is fully set off with commas. Again, except for when it's necessary to the meaning, in which case there will be no commas. So let me give an example here. I'm going to say a sentence. My brother, Logan, goes to college. Okay. If I have one brother, my brother, Logan. Logan is one of those noun phrases. It's in a positive. It is redefining my brother. Okay. So if I say my brother, Logan, goes to college, if I only have one brother, you don't need to know his name, right? You know it's my one brother. So I would say my brother, comma, Logan, comma, goes to college. But what if I have two brothers? And I do, I have two brothers. Okay, if I have my brother goes to college, it's a sentence, right? But which one? Is it Logan or is it Foster? You don't know from that sentence that I just said. It is unclear. So there, knowing that it's Logan who goes to college is important. So here you would instead say, my brother Logan goes to college with no commas, because you need to know it's Logan and not Foster. That is not clear from the sentence. Hopefully that makes sense. So if we need it for the meaning, no commas. If it is extra, unnecessary for the meaning, commas. Okay, so must be properly set off with commas. So commas on both sides. If it's in the middle, at the end, if it's at the beginning, if it's at the end. And again, if it's unnecessary for the meaning. There's another rule, which is that modifiers must be properly placed. Usually, again, these are general rules. Usually, modifiers are going to be right next to what they describe. Okay, so typically when we're describing something, we want to put it next to the thing that we're describing. And that just makes it more clear. So let me give you an example. what's the one that I normally do? I saw my friend on a field trip to the zoo. Okay, so I saw my friend on a field trip to the zoo is a modifier, on a field trip to the zoo. But because of the way that sentence is structured, I don't know, is it me who's on the field trip? Is it my friend who's on the field trip? Is it both of us who are on the field trip? I don't know. I can't really tell. It's a sentence, but it's not a clear sentence. So what we'd like to do is restructure that sentence so it's unambiguous. It's totally clear. So there I might say, on a field trip to the zoo, I saw my friend. There it's clear. It's right next to me. I'm the one on the field trip. I see my friend. Now, I want to note something here for both of those rules, with the commas, with the placement. All of the sentences I said were grammatically correct. Whether I've got commas around Logan or no commas around Logan, both grammatically correct. Whether I say on a field trip to the zoo at the beginning or at the end, grammatically correct. What changes is the meaning. So what does that teach us? It teaches us that we have to consider meaning. So we have to know the rules, right? But the rules are a little bit more complicated because it's the application of those rules that matters. So we need to consider meaning when we are attacking these sentences. So tips. Sometimes multiple answers work grammatically, like everything I said on the previous slide, all grammatically correct. Or maybe we just can't tell what is or what isn't grammatical. In that case, we need to remember that grammar exists in service of meaning. The only reason that grammar exists is so that we can be more clear, which is why grammar actually changes over time, right? For instance, we used to have a lot of grammar rules. If you've ever heard someone talk in like Old English, it's totally different than what we would say today. So that's a change in grammar due to a change in how we hope to be understood. Grammar rules change even today. I'm going to bet that in the next 5 to 10 years, the grammar on the SAT changes as language develops with society. So grammar exists in service of meaning. What does that mean for this test? It means that if we consider the meaning, we can often figure out the grammar. We can often figure out the correct answers. So when you're going, I don't know, you're going, maybe it doesn't come down to grammar or I can't figure the grammar out. Ask yourself, what is the author trying to say? What's the author trying to say? Am I at the zoo? Or are they at the zoo? I don't know. Let's figure it out, and that can tell us where to put modifiers. Is this word, phrase, clause, etc. necessary? So thinking about it, do I need Logan? Is that important to this sentence? Yes or no? If it is, okay, no commas. If it's not, okay, commas. But then also, who or what is this pronoun, verb, modifier, etc. referring to? So should this modifier be next to this thing or this thing? This also works for pronouns and for verbs, which is something that we're going to get to tomorrow. But this idea of considering meaning when we're kind of stuck is going to keep coming back with these questions. Okay. With that said, let's go ahead and try some questions about modifiers. First, we're going to try one that's about commas with modifiers. Then we're going to try one that's about placement. So here, if we take a look at this question, we should notice, one, that this sentence is awful. It's really long, a lot of commas. So we might want to do a little bit of cutting the fluff here to make this a little bit simpler. But we should also notice, if we look at the answer choices, that the differences are just commas. Here, we've got a comma here and a comma here. In B, we've got, both of those commas, but also an extra comma. That's fun. In C, we have a comma only here. In D, we have a comma only here. So the only differences between these answer choices are commas. Okay. So if this happens to be near a modifier, we might be considering, how do we properly punctuate modifier questions? Okay, now that I've said all of this, go ahead and give this a go. Again, if you're not entirely sure, maybe consider doing some cut the fluff on this sentence. Let's go ahead and answer either in the chat or in the poll, A, B, C, or D. Let me know what you think. Take about 30 seconds. And we got a poll up, so if you can answer in that poll, even if you've already answered in the chat, that'd be great. Oh, and if you think it's the same sentence, that's answer choice A. That's no change. Oh, and sorry, that should be underlined. That is a mistake in these slides. Heads up, really good catch to the person who noticed that. Okay. All right, we can probably go ahead and close up that poll. So go ahead and get in a last minute answer if you've got one. But I am seeing that the majority of the answers, again, around 71%, are answer choice A. And that is in fact correct. But let's go ahead and talk about why that's the correct answer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of cut the fluff. So I'm not going to cut anything that's in the underlined portion because that's the part that I don't know about, except for maybe that. These skeptics, known as Oxfordians, believe that everything from this that to the end of the sentence is what the skeptics believe. All gone. Don't need it. And I'm going to cut the that in all of these answer choices because everything there is a relative clause. It is all of the stuff that these skeptics believe. So my sentence is now, these skeptics, known as Oxfordians, believe. Great. Now, what I'm also noting is that I have two commas surrounding known as Oxfordians in A. And I take a look at known, and that's an irregular past tense. It is basically knowed, the past of know. So this is an ED. It doesn't look like it, but it is one. So I'm going, this is potentially a modifier known as Oxfordians. Let's think about this. Known as Oxfordians is describing the skeptics. The skeptics are known as Oxfordians. This could be a modifier. Okay, well, it might be okay if that modifier is set off by two commas. So I kind of like A. That's fine. And yes, we are going to be sharing this recording. So if you've got to go, it'll be there. Don't worry. So I'm going, okay, I like A. Let me look at these other answers. Okay, taking a look at B. B throws in a bonus comma. What is that doing? This is something we're going to learn in punctuation, but when we have punctuation, particularly commas, we need to justify it. Why is that comma there? And this comma is actively just distracting. It is making the sentence more unclear, known as Oxfordians. What? Known as Oxfordians is the modifier. It is describing the skeptics. So there's no reason for this extra comma. It just confuses us. What part is the modifier? Is it known as? Is it Oxfordians? Are they two different things? No. One thought, one modifier. B is not correct. C only leaves one comma. Well, that's very strange, right? If our modifier is known as Oxfordians, it needs to be set off with a comma on both sides. Having one comma means that our modifier is either these skeptics known as Oxfordians or believe that blah, 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 blah. If we take out either part of that sentence, we are left with something that is not a complete sentence. That doesn't make sense. the modifier is known as Oxfordian, so we need a comma on both sides. Doesn't work. D does the exact opposite. It puts the comma beforehand, but not after. That doesn't make sense. We need one on both sides to indicate what our modifier is. D is out. It's got to be A. Now notice here that they did not include an answer with no commas. These skeptics known as Oxfordians believe. Now that would be a much harder question. All right, because there we would need to judge, do I need that phrase? Do I need to know that they're known as Oxfordians? Or do I just know which skeptics we're talking about? Or are we dealing with multiple skeptics and I have to know their names? That would be a much harder question. They don't do that here. They theoretically could. There we might need to look at the context a little bit more. But with this question, we need to know the rules about commas and modifiers. And we need to think a little bit about the meaning. Which part is the modifier? Okay, really great job with this one. Let's try another modifiers question. This one's a little bit different. So we had one that was about commas. This one's also about meaning and modifiers, but this one is about placement. Now you might be going, well, I don't know how that is. Okay, I want you to take a look at this first sentence, and I want to start this one together first. Just read this first sentence and tell me, do you notice any words that you think indicate a modifier? What words in this sentence maybe say, I am a modifier and I'm important to this sentence? In the chat when you think you see a modifier in the sentence. We got a good answer already. Can give it a little bit longer if anyone else wants to contribute. I'm not looking for the answer, looking for the modifier word. Okay, we got a couple of folks with the modifier word. It is while. WH. All right, that does not mean it's the only modifier in the sentence. Someone else noticed through the hills. That is also a prepositional phrase. That's great, really good. But here, while performing one of these painful runs through the hills, that is one gigantic modifier. Okay, we know modifiers need to be set off with commas. Great, it is. It's got a comma at the end. We also know that modifiers need to be properly placed. They need to be next to what they describe. With that in mind, take a look at these answer choices and answer either in the chat or in the poll, A, B, C, or D. Which one do you think gives us a correctly placed modifier? And if you can answer in the poll, that's just helpful. Now, if you're going, but wait, the modifier isn't moving. How do I make it correctly placed? Notice that the words next to the modifier might be moving. So maybe think about, what is the modifier describing in A? What is the modifier describing in B? What's the modifier describing in C? And what's the modifier describing in D? Pick the one that makes the most sense. About 10 more seconds. Go ahead and get in a guess if you're not sure. Okay. Nice. So I am seeing once again that the correct answer is the most popular one, but let's go through this one together, right? Because this one's a little bit tougher. So I'm going to just quickly clear the screen just to make that a little bit easier to see. And again, we're dealing with this modifier while performing one of these painful runs through the hills. So we know in this sentence that someone or something is performing a painful run through the hills. Well, let's take a look at A. While performing one of these painful runs through the hills, one of his teachers took note of his incredible racing ability. Okay, that's interesting. Actually, before we talk about A, who do you think is running through the hills? In the chat, just with words. Who do you think is running through the hills? Just with words. Who should be running through the hills in this sentence? Yeah, okay. Bakila. Bakila, probably not the teacher. Yeah, exactly. So we know that Bakila is running for marathons. Bakila has this incredible natural racing ability, right? That makes sense. In A, it's the teacher. So in A, we have this teacher running through the hills. And the teacher is going, wow, that Bakila is sure a good runner. Well, I don't know. What's Bakila doing? Is Bakila just sitting there? That doesn't make any sense. Okay. So we're going, it's not the teacher. It should be Bakila. Okay. Well, that allows us to roll out B pretty quickly because there we have noticing his incredible natural racing ability was one of his teachers. What? Okay. I want it to be Bakila. So again, I'm leaning toward C and D because they both start with Bakila. But how do I tell the difference between C and D? And I saw that most people picked D. Why not C? I'm going to tell you why. Because Bakila's. Oh. This isn't a noun. Remember when we cut out crew of Rexes because it was descriptive? Bakila's is descriptive. It's describing incredible natural racing ability. So here, it's not Bakila who's running through the hills. It's Bakila's incredible natural racing ability that's running through the hills. So his ability is running? That doesn't make sense. I want Bakila, the person, to be running. Gone. The correct answer is D. All right. So here we're using logic to figure out which has the most likely meaning. So I'm saying, hey, it's not mentioned in the paragraph. Maybe the teacher could be running while watching a video of Bakila. Like, yes, theoretically that could be true. So we have to make a small logical leap here. The runner here is Bakila. Bakila has the natural racing ability. Bakila is running the marathon. And if we read the rest of the passage, we see that it's a passage about Bakila being a marathon runner. So with that information, we can go, it's Bakila. Bakila is the one who's running. While technically A is a grammatically correct sentence, and so is C, frankly, it doesn't make sense. So we have to go to meaning sometimes with even grammar questions. All right, really, really great job. What time is that? Okay, it is 5:23. So I am going to make a judgment call. And that judgment call is let's save punctuation for next time. Let's do punctuation in tomorrow's lesson, and that's going to be okay. But if you take a look, you can see that there is a lot that we are going to cover in tomorrow's lesson about punctuation. We're going to get into commas, review some of the stuff we talked about with modifiers. I had a question earlier. Can we use em dashes to set off these modifiers? Absolutely, we can. We're going to learn that as well. And we're going to learn a rule that most test takers mess up. How the heck do you use a colon? Most people don't know. I'm going to teach you. So we're going to do that next time, but I'm going to go ahead and skip through it. fun little preview. And then we are also going to do parallelism, tense, agreement, possessives, and idioms. So we are going through a lot of stuff tomorrow. So come back tomorrow for more information. But right now, we are going to take questions for the remaining 7 minutes. I'm going to remind you of this code, SAT Crash 20 for 20% off of, oh, it says live classes, but that's a lie. It is 20% off of any of our plans for SAT or ACT. And right now, we can do a raffle for a month of free SAT prep with Magoosh. So if you want to stick around for that, stay here. If you want to ask questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat. Ken, are we ready to do a raffle? If you're not interested in the raffle, not interested in asking questions, come back here same time tomorrow, 4 p.m. Pacific, for punctuation and all of those other things I just said, so we can wrap up the rest of our SAT writing crash course. All right. See folks later. And if you've got questions, in the chat. Okay, I've got a couple of questions while we're waiting for the raffle. Do we have a crash course for math and reading already on YouTube? We do not. This is actually our first official crash course on YouTube. If you are interested in learning about reading passages, I would recommend checking out our free live class, our free SAT live class that is on our YouTube channel. We cover how to work through reading passages. We do not talk about reading questions though, and we don't have anything specifically for math yet. That's something we might consider doing in the future. We have videos on math, but if you're interested in reading and math, that's like a lot of topics. So I might recommend that you sign up for our live classes where we cover all of the topics on the test, including 2 lessons of reading, and on SAT, we do 4 lessons of math. So that's a lot of stuff. So I really recommend that. It's like the bulk of what's on our live classes. So I recommend signing up to get all of that material before your test date. What else have we got? Oh, and I'm seeing in the chat, we'll be raffling out a $50 gift card if you fill out our survey. So if you see that survey link in the chat, highly, highly, highly recommend that you fill that out. It's really, really useful for us, and also a $50 gift card. It's pretty sweet. I'm seeing a lot of folks who don't know how to use the dash. Don't worry, we're going to talk about it next time. And yes, we'll be posting the video for tomorrow on YouTube as well. So if you want to catch up and just watch another time, you absolutely can. Got a question. Where can I sign up for live classes? Ooh, there's a link in the chat. Ken's on it. So check out that link and you can sign up there. And again, this code will work for live classes, but it'll also work for other plans. My slide is just wrong. So SAT Crash 20. Ooh, I got a question. How many vocab words roughly should we memorize for the SAT? I do not really recommend memorizing vocab for the SAT. This is something I've talked about in various things before, but the big thing with vocab is that it used to be a bigger component of the SAT, and it's just not anymore. The questions that have to do with vocab are going to be more about meaning in context and meanings of words that you probably already know. Not so much the like one meaning of unfamiliar words. Is going to be which one of the 4 meanings of this familiar word works in this sentence. So usually those questions are less about memorization and more about logical reasoning. So I don't recommend studying vocab for the SAT. I think it's a waste of time in almost all cases. If you do run into a word you don't know, look at the other answers or look at the surrounding context and do your best with it. But there's no guarantee that you're going to see like any word on the SAT. So it's really not a great use of time. Usually stuff like strategy is going to be significantly more effective. Okay, we've got our raffle happening right now. I've got some other questions. I'll answer those right after the raffle, so stick around. Woo! Consacon! Awesome. So if you are the winner, Consacon, for a free month of prep for SAT. Go ahead and email the email in the chat, email Hyun, and can get you set up with a free account. Congrats, so exciting. Now that account does not have access to live classes. To answer another question here, I already have a Magoosh account. How do I tell if I have access to the live classes? If you did not sign up for a live classes account specifically, you do not have live classes access, but you can get it. So the way you can do that is you can write into help@magoosh.com and they can help upgrade you to that account. You can also use this discount code. So not only will you get a discount because you're upgrading, but you'll also get that 20%, which is like awesome. So if you are not signed up for live classes, maybe because you just signed up for a premium account, really recommend doing that. Highly recommend. And see some of you tomorrow if you're rolling out. Oh, and then I saw another question. There is a common strategy I've heard called parallelism, where you compare the endings of words after a comma. Is that a valid strategy? Yes, it is. I think of parallelism actually as like a type of grammar and not a strategy. It's actually something that we're going to cover tomorrow. It's going to be the thing that we cover right after punctuation. So if you are curious about parallelism, yes, we are talking about it tomorrow. Come back and I'll talk about what that means and when it applies. But yes, it is awesome and a really quick way to get through questions around lists. And if you filled out the survey for the gift card, pretty sure you're just going to hold on and you'll be contacted if you won the raffle. But Hyun can describe that a little bit more. I'm so glad that this was helpful. Again, come see us tomorrow for more information. See you then. Okay, let me see if I missed anything else. We had a question, how long does this discount work? It's going to be open for a few days. Hyun already answered that one. Yay, cool. Glad folks are joining tomorrow and for future courses. I'm going to stick around for a few more minutes, even though our time is up. If you have any additional questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat. Okay, it looks like we're okay, but if anyone has any questions that they're actively typing up or that they're not sure yet, you can always ask those tomorrow at the end of our live session. We're going to go ahead and close out now, but thank you so much for attending and I will see you tomorrow. Oh, we got a couple more questions. All right, I'll answer this. What are some tips I would recommend if it's hard to understand the context of the writing passage? So that's not really something we're covering in this particular crash course because that's something that deals more with the writing rhetoric questions. So what would my recommendation be? One, I would prioritize getting the grammar stuff down because that's going to be just a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. You're going to get more points out of it. And then maybe we can talk tomorrow a little bit about rhetoric at the very end of the section, just because I don't want to confuse the grammar topics because those typically don't have a ton to do with context. I have the on-demand plan. Oh, where do I see the live class schedule? Oh, if you have the on-demand classes, you should have gotten an email with information about that. So check your email about to see if something has shown up about those. And if you don't see an email from us, I would recommend just writing into help@magoosh.com and they'll hook you up with that information. Yeah, thanks for letting me know. And then we got a question, are the keywords Keyword questions hard to answer. Are we talking about reading here? If we're talking about keywords, it depends on your approach with the strategy. I would recommend checking out our free live class for some discussion about keyword skimming, because that's something that would really, really help you for keyword focused questions on the reading section. Okay, if we are not talking about that, I don't know what. I don't quite know what you're referring to. If you want to give me a little more detail in the chat about what you mean by a keyword question, I can help you out. Ooh, in the writing where we have the definition of a word. Again, not really a question type that we're going to be dealing with in this section, because that's more like a rhetoric type question. So not something that we're dealing with for grammar. But my recommendation there, like with other rhetoric writing questions, is going to be to make a prediction. So going, what word do I think fits in this blank? All right, so come up with your own word or your own phrase, and then compare to the answer choices to go, which answer choice best matches my prediction. That's just going to make your life easier. Typically, they try to choose words that are going to be a little bit more known, but if you don't know a word there, just ignore it for now. Look at the other ones and do process of elimination. If you eliminate all but the word you don't know, that's your answer. If you find another answer that you're going, that's a perfect match for my prediction, pick that one. It didn't matter that you didn't know the other word. So again, I don't really recommend studying vocab, but a prediction is going to be your best bet there. Okay. Oh, and then what if it's hard for me to understand what each word in the option means? My recommendation is to start with the ones you do know. So start with the ones that you do know, and do process of elimination there. And then if you're seeing a word and you're like, I'm not super sure what that means, think about if you've heard it before. How would that word be used in a sentence? So for instance, thinking about like an actual SAT question, there's one where there's food, and that food is being described as, or is this an actual SAT question? I think so. It might be from another test. But the food is being described as like several different words. And one of the words that the food is being described as is like surly. Now that may not be a word that you've ever used, but if you think about it, okay, how maybe have I heard the word surly used before? Well, maybe you've heard it to describe like a really grumpy person, like a biker who like wants to fight. And you're going, should that describe food? Well, I don't know. I would use it to describe a biker, but not food. Okay, so probably because the one context I have for it is not similar to the one here, that's probably right. Similarly, like ominous. Okay, maybe again, not a word I would use, but when I think about the word ominous, I'm thinking like, okay, I would think about like dark clouds are often ominous. Maybe like I think about like a horror movie or like vampires or something. And I'm going, does that apply to food? Probably not. Okay, so even if I don't know the perfect meaning of that word, I can still kind of from context go, does that fit for how I'm describing it? All right, so again, I don't really recommend studying vocabulary. We do have some vocabulary resources out there if you are nervous about it. But again, I recommend focusing on your strategies more than anything. Those are going to be more helpful on more questions than vocabulary is. All right, I think we're good to go. If you have additional questions, again, you can throw those in maybe the comments on this video, or you can ask them in our live stream tomorrow. But thank you for attending the first half of our SAT crash course for writing grammar. I will see you tomorrow for more. Bye.